A Box of Darkness, The Story of a Marriage, by Sally Ryder Brady. Narrated by Joyce Bean. Copyright 2011 by Sally Ryder Brady. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with St. Martin's Press and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. This paper boat, carefully placed upon the future, it tips from the breeze and skims away, frail thing of words, this Valentine, so far to sail. And if you find it caught in the reeds, its message blurred, the thought that you are holding it a moment is enough for me. Ted Kuzer, Valentines, University of Nebraska Press, 2008. Prelude. Parsqua est meminice doloris. It is part of grief to remember. Ovid. Woods Hole, Massachusetts, March 30th, 2008. The Sunday after Easter dawns bitter cold, but at least Cape Cod is sunny, and there is no wind. Yesterday my son Nathaniel removed the winter plastic from his 19-foot open boat, scrubbed the hull, and polished the fittings. This morning he hitched up the trailer and towed the boat from his house outside Boston to Woods Hole, where the other 3 children, Sarah, Andrew, and Alexander, and I have assembled on the town dock. We are bundled in down, fleece, and Gore-Tex, knowing it will be even colder on the open water. Sarah has brought 100 daffodils and tulips from Connecticut, nestled in a large carton. Natty has a thermos of hot tea. Andrew casts off, and the boat slips away, the bow turning toward Vineyard Sound. Martha's Vineyard lies on our left, Nashon Island on our right. We are heading to Tarpaulin Cove off Nashon, 5 miles down the Sound. We are just passing the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution when I look for the square gray box, deceptively heavy, that holds Upton's ashes. I don't see it in the cockpit or in the small cabin. Where's Upton? I ask. 4 pairs of blue eyes meet mine.
On the front hall table at Aunt Joni's.
We all start to laugh, a quiet, guilty laugh at first that soon gets raucous. Natty turns the boat around and we head back to the dock. How could we have forgotten Upton? Easy. We forgot him because he wasn't here to remind us. Sarah drives back to the house, and we try again. This time we make it to Tarpaulin Cove. Natty heads close in to the curve of the northeast shore and cuts the engine. Suddenly the air is still and almost warm. The empty, weathered house, the barn, and the outhouse stand stark vigil on a windswept rise behind the beach. The nearest house is 4 miles away, and today, in March, ours is the only boat in view. For over 30 years, we have been lucky guests on this privately owned island. Upton always said that being at the Cove was like living in the 18th century. No electricity, indoor plumbing, telephone, or cars. Time slowed down, and we paid attention to the smallest details of daily life, washing ourselves and our clothes with water pumped by hand from the well, taking care of trash and garbage, trimming the Aladdin lamps, preparing food using as little gas as possible. Even planning meals took extra care because at the Cove we used what was there and what was about to spoil, harvested what was in the garden or in the sea. Running to the store meant leaving the island, an all-day event. We lived by the sun, pinching each other to stay awake until 9 every night so we wouldn't wake up before 5. Natty's boat drifts lazily across the clear water, held in the crescent of white beach, while memories from past summers lap like the waves on the hull. We haven't planned a ceremony, but one evolves. There's Pa's wind vane on the fence post, and the screen door he built from scraps. Remember when he discovered all the wood at the French watering place and towed it back behind the whaler? That was the summer Upton decided to rebuild the deck by the back door, a complicated project in a house with no electricity on an island without cars or shops. Remember when he got the toilet to work again? That project took 2 years. No, 3. The plumbing at the Cove is far from modern, with an outhouse, a sun shower, and a well. There was indoor plumbing once, The airy bathroom and generous clawfoot bathtub attest to this. But there was no hot water, and the toilet hadn't worked for years. Because we relied on a small Briggs and Stratton gas engine in the cellar to pump well water into the house once or twice a week, we used water sparingly to save on fuel. Even if the toilet didn't leak, insufficient pressure would have made normal flushing out of the question. But, said Upton, if the leaky pipes to and from the toilet were replaced, we could at least use the John at night and have a single flush in the morning. The older we got, the less we enjoyed going downstairs and across the grass to the outhouse in the middle of the night, especially in the teeth of a nor'easter. Upton steadfastly set to work on the pipes, and 3 summers later we celebrated Flush Day. Upton chilled a bottle of champagne in the gas refrigerator and made a hazelnut torte, grinding the nuts by hand in the moully. I put on my pearls, and we waltzed up and down the sandy hall on bare feet to Strauss, played on the out-of-tune piano by a visiting concert pianist. The boat is almost in front of the house now, and I spot the old pier piling on the beach, and remember the long-ago night I spent wrapped in a soggy towel, my back against the rotting wood. The house had been full of visitors and children, and after dinner in our bedroom, Upton, mean from too much whiskey, turned on me. "You're a big phony, a social climber." He came close and raised his hand. I'd seen Upton drunk. Almost every night he had too much to drink. But this was the first time I was ever afraid of him. I took off for the beach in my nightgown, figuring that without an audience he would stop ranting and soon pass out. I could have crept back later and slipped into bed beside him, but I needed the night alone to sort things out. Upton had crossed a line. Alone on the beach, I realized that I could no longer ignore his anger. An ounce too much of bourbon was all it took for him to erupt. Sarah had just turned 13, Alex was 7, and Andrew and Natty were 11 and 9. I would have to figure out a way to keep us all safe. Now, as the wind and tide take Natty's boat toward the lighthouse bluffs, I also remember sweet afternoons when the children were off fishing or sailing, and Upton and I would spread our towels behind the boulders, make salty love and lie together in the sun, the southwest wind caressing our skin. I think of the nights when the lighthouse beam would flash at 1-minute intervals on the wall above our bed while we came together as quietly as possible, inevitably betrayed by the rhythmic screech of rusty bedsprings. Closer to shore now, we see 2 cows grazing on the tawny grasses up behind the lighthouse. On the beach below, a large coyote appears, sees the boat, and stops to sniff the air. He decides we're nothing to him, and trots off, king of the cove. Natty looks at his watch, at the buoy behind the rocks, and finally out at the cold blue sound, as if fixing his position with the land and tide. "Mom, I think we should do it right here." That's when we spot a colony of harbor seals on the rocks ahead. They watch us, and we watch them. Finally, one slithers off his rock and swims up to the boat, gazing at us with round, dark eyes. He waits while I open the box. When I let go of the first handful of ashes, the wind catches them and blows them back at us. Some land, sweet and salty on my tongue, my last taste of Upton. The next handful lands in the water. Caught by the sun, the ashes begin to sparkle as they slowly drift away from the boat. Then it is the children's turn, everyone tossing Upton into the sea while the seal looks gravely on. We toss the flowers in next. Suddenly, without a ripple, the seal dives, a fleeting shadow beneath the milky cloud. We are done, but still stand, transfixed by the nebula of winking ashes that continues to drift just inches below the surface of the water, surrounded now by a fleet of bobbing tulips and daffodils. Just before Natty starts the engine, he says he has something to sing. "I heard it on the radio driving down this morning," he says. "An old Mississippi John Hurt song." He says this with a gleam in his eyes and a touch of shyness in his voice so familiar, I hold tight to the side of the boat. I listen to Natty's bluesy ballad, "Let the Mermaids Flirt with Me," its words so appropriate to this little boat full of mourners. Are we all remembering the gentle nights when Upton took out his guitar,
and sang to us with that same tender playfulness. Sloop John B., Shenandoah, Jamaica farewell. Natty's words settle on the water, the seals watch from the rocks, and slowly the boat turns away and noses out into the Sound. A breeze is picking up, and I hunch into my old down jacket. It's all over. The hard years of Upton's drinking and clinical depression, his exhausting and relentless struggle with emotions, his and everyone else's, these are finished. I think of his increasing isolation in life and of his new final isolation in death. What do I really know of Upton? What do I know of his life, of our life together? What do I know that I didn't know I knew until now? Mary Oliver's The Uses of Sorrow runs through my head. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this, too, was a gift. The box that held Upton's ashes sits beside me, empty, swept clean by the wind on the sunny deck of Natty's boat. But I'm still holding that other box in my heart, the one full of darkness. 1. We cannot tell the story of anything without telling the story of everything. Thomas Barry. Vermont, March 23, 2008. My husband, Upton Bernie Brady, was born on Easter Sunday, April 17, 1938, at the Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. His mother, Maudie, short for Mother Dear, used to speak of this confluence with wonder. Cigarette between her fingers, she would tell how her young husband, Francis, had come to the hospital fresh from Mass, his arms full of violets. Susie, 6, Ellen, almost 4, and 15-month-old Francis, called Buff, were at home with their stuffed bunnies and their grandmother. "To be born on Easter," Maudie would say, smoke circling her head, "on the feast of the resurrection, is to be twice blessed." Now it is Easter again, and the house in Vermont is bursting with our grown children and their children, everyone painting eggs at the dining-room table. The ham is in the oven. The jelly beans have been hidden. There is a foot of snow outside and not a violet anywhere. The adult children are coping, but I am in a bubble of disbelief, which keeps bursting when I don't see Upton anywhere. The chair where he sits with the Times crossword puzzle is empty. On his desk, untouched, lies the manuscript he was editing, his wry comments, 2 in Latin, so neatly penciled in the margins. Upton's ordinary, everyday handwriting is as legible and well-proportioned as his chancery italic on handmade Christmas tags. His final shopping list, dishwash, steak, pots, remains intact on the refrigerator door. His slippers are waiting on the floor by his side of the bed. While I notice these things, the children are urging me to come up with a plan for his memorial service. Our eldest son, Andrew, his wife Mari, and their 2 young children have come all the way from San Francisco, and it would save them $2,000 if we could do everything within 3 weeks. Upton always said he wanted to be buried at sea, and we've agreed to scatter his ashes the following weekend. But I truly do not know what Upton would want us to do for a public memorial service, where he would want it to be, or even if he would want one at all. And then the thought crosses my mind that it doesn't really matter what Upton would want. We're doing this for the living, not for him. We just have trouble saying it. We have trouble saying many things. 3 nights ago, Natty was the first to get here. Upton's body was taken away by the undertaker at 10, and Natty arrived at midnight. We had a beer, and I told him how Upton had had a bath late in the day, as he frequently did, but then hadn't come down to watch the weather. Upton never liked watching the news, but he always watched the weather, every night at 6:15. I had heard the water sluicing down the pipes around 6, and when the weather came on, I wondered why he still hadn't come downstairs. Afterward I put the gratin in the oven, set the table, and went up to check on him. The bathroom door was closed, a strip of light coming from the bottom. I knew as I knocked and called out, breathing in the piney scent of rosemary oil from the bath salts, that something was wrong. I didn't wait for a reply, just opened the door, and there he was. clean and sweet and dry, his torso in the empty tub, his legs hanging over the side, his strong feet pink, each toenail smooth and nicely shaped. I tried to picture him perched on the edge of the tub, trying to catch his breath after the long hot soak. His heart must have stopped. Not enough oxygen, then a quick collapse and a gentle slide back into the tub. His blue eyes were closed, and his face so beautifully serene. No body fluids, no bruises, no life. Just an overwhelming peace. I told Natty how my neighbor Kitty had stayed with me while kind men streamed into the house. Paramedics, police, the medical examiner, the undertaker. I told him my answer when the paramedics asked me if they should continue their efforts to bring Upton back to life. I knew that even if they were miraculously successful in getting his heart to work again, no one could restore Upton's brain, oxygen deprived for at least 20 minutes. Natty listened while I told him about the day. Unexpectedly, Upton's and my last together. Unexpectedly, because even though Upton had recently been diagnosed with emphysema and had a history of heart problems, he was on medication and his short-term prognosis was good. It had snowed all night and most of the day. Upton, wedded to his daily routine and usually undaunted by slippery roads, decided at 10 not to get the mail, and at 12:30 not even to go out for his usual lunch at the co-op. In the soft daylight of falling snow, we polished off Sunday's asparagus soup, our backs warmed by the wood stove. We talked about the books we were working on and the taxes that were soon due. Upton cooked Mondays through Thursdays. He hated leftovers and shopped every day for that night's supper when he went out for lunch. Since he hadn't gone out, I offered to turn Sunday's baked ham into supper with leeks, potatoes, and a little cheese, and he was grateful. "I've been cold all day," he said. "If you cook, I can have a nice hot bath before dinner." We talked about Easter, coming up soon, and where we would go to celebrate the victory of life over death. Our beloved and liberal pastor had retired suddenly a few years ago, driven out by spurious gossip of gay activities, and his humorless replacement made both of us crazy with his ultra-conservative doctrine. "Let's drive down to Cambridge and go to St. Paul's," suggested Upton. "We could stop for lunch on the way back." A fine plan. St. Paul's had been Upton's church while he was at Harvard, and again 5 years later when we moved back to Cambridge from New York. I received my religious instruction at St. Paul's, and 6 months later made my first communion there, a brand-new Catholic and mother of 3 small children. St. Paul's was also home to the Boston Boy Choir, and blessed with extraordinary music. But a few minutes after suggesting we go to St. Paul's, Upton changed his mind. "You know, I don't want to be seen in any Roman Catholic church. Let's just stay here." Both of us were disgusted by the rash of reports of rampant sexual abuse and furious at the way the church continued to protect its pederast priests. But there was also sorrow in Upton's voice, and I knew he missed the liturgy and the liturgical calendar that had been so central throughout his almost 70 years. Upton would deliberately astonish people he barely knew by saying he had been raised in a Benedictine monastery, as if he'd been a foundling left in the care of the good brothers. A colorful story, but the truth is that his father was the lay headmaster at the Portsmouth Priory, now Portsmouth Abbey School, in Rhode Island. The Bradys lived in an 18th-century farmhouse on the Priory grounds, where the sound of the chapel bell measured their days from lauds to Compline. The church was in the air they breathed, its sacrificial doctrine embedded in their flesh and blood. A few minutes later, Upton put his soup spoon down. "You know," he said, blue eyes fixed on the snow, "when I come back to this world, I think I'd like to come back as a stone." "A stone?" He turned his gaze on me. "Stones are peaceful. Don't you think that would be a good way to return?" Why was he thinking of returning when he was still right here with me? I didn't say that, nor did I mention that it would be cold to be a stone today in this snow. I didn't say that maybe stones don't have feelings. I just nodded and said, "Yes, very peaceful. I talked until Natty and I were both spent. It was time for bed, something I'd been dreading. I looked at my son, standing in the kitchen, solid and robust. "Natty, what will I do? Where will I sleep?" He gave me a stern, blue-eyed stare. "Mom, if you ever want to sleep in that bed again, you'd better do it now." Natty was right. I spent what was left of the night in Upton's and my old spool bed, with his clean scent still on the pillow, and the terrain of his body visible in the hollows of our old mattress. Boston, June 1956. I first met Upton Brady at the Boston Cotillion. In May I graduated from Fox Hollow, a small girls' boarding school in Lenox, Massachusetts, and a week later I turned 17. In September I would start my freshman year at Barnard College in New York. But on that June night in the ornate ballroom of the old Copley Plaza, with its gilded chairs and potted palms, I was a wary Boston debutante in a rustling long white dress and creamy kid gloves that stopped at my shoulders. There were 100 of us, each with shiny hair, our teeth straight, lined up to proceed on our father's arms down the length of the ballroom to the 6 matrons waiting to welcome us into Boston society. 2 of these women, with their glittering diamond rings and pearl chokers, were mothers of friends from school. They'd given me rides in their station wagons. I'd seen them in blue jeans, raking leaves and scouring their kitchens, and now, as the master of ceremonies announced my name, I curtsied to them. Not just a little bob of a curtsy, but all the way to the floor. It was hard not to giggle. George, my cotillion escort, home for the summer from Yale, was a good friend, not a boyfriend. Like me, he was tongue-in-cheek about the debutante ritual. What's more, he was a quick, sure-footed partner, making me feel like Sid Charisse as we circled and dipped beneath the winking chandeliers. Unlike most couples that night, we were there to dance, not flirt. I think that's why Upton cut in, for the dancing. "Upton Brady." He bowed slightly as he took my gloved hand, and I thought he clicked his heels, though it happened so fast I wasn't sure. "Sally Ryder," I said, caught suddenly by the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. Most men at dancing parties were much too tall for me, their feet too big. But not this blonde, fine-boned Harvard sophomore with startlingly blue eyes. When he put his hand firmly against my back and propelled me across the polished floor, our bodies fit, leg to leg, pelvis to pelvis, I instinctively knew what his next step would be. When, without any warning, he let me drop almost to the floor in a dip, I didn't miss a beat. And when someone cut in a few minutes later, I was sorry and glad. Sorry the dance with Upton was over, but glad it was clear I was no wallflower. Maybe, I thought, he'll cut in again. And he did, several times that night, each time asking me to tell him my name one more time. Upton Brady, impeccably turned out in his grandfather's tails, boiled shirt with gold studs and wing collar, was charming, even when tipsy, even when he couldn't remember my name. It seemed as if he could physically telegraph to my body whatever steps he was inventing on the dance floor, making each swooping waltz and sultry tango feel as natural as breathing. At the many coming-out parties that followed the cotillion, Upton would often appear, a self-proclaimed Deb's delight. He would cut in and skim me across the floor, tails whipping around his narrow hips. At every party, when the music stopped, he would give me a slightly sheepish look, his eyes too bright. "I'm terribly sorry," he'd say, his hand still firm against the small of my back, "but I've had too much to drink." My debutante years sped by, with many dancing parties and many dancing partners, handsome, eligible young men who, unlike Upton, did remember my name. But Upton was the one I looked for. The summer of 1956, right after the cotillion, I was an apprentice at the Cambridge Drama Festival, a summer theater company that put on 3 high-powered equity shows: St. Joan, starring Siobhan McKenna, The Beggar's Opera with Shirley Jones and Jack Cassidy, and Henry V with Michael Wager, Douglas Watson, and Felicia Montelegre, who was married to Leonard Bernstein. Overnight I became more bohemian than debutante. my silky page boy now replaced by saucy gammon fringe. Two of the producers, Bryant Halliday and William Morris Hunt, were founders of the Brattle Theatre Company, an avant-garde professional company in Cambridge. Halliday and several of the actors were openly homosexual, something no one paid much attention to. I had never known anyone who was queer, at least not that I knew of. I didn't even know what it was they did, just that it was forbidden. Bryant had a beautiful young French boy, 10 or 11, living with him. I didn't know what their relationship was, but there were hints of sex that made me uneasy, and made me think there was something sinister about Bryant. I never felt comfortable around him, but the other homosexual men were more familiar to me, easy to be around, and I soon stopped thinking of them as different from any of the other assorted theater people. I met Nikos at the end of that summer at a typical Cambridge party in a hot, crowded third-floor garret. I was sitting on top of the refrigerator wearing a red Lands dress sprinkled with valentines. Nikos appeared, so tall his dark eyes were nearly level with mine from my perch. He looked like a young Gregory Peck, only darker and even more handsome, his lips curved in a classic archaic smile. Nikos, with his laundered English shirts and formal European manners, was not a bit like the other scruffy, sandaled Harvard Square actor-slash-playwrights, and I wanted him to ask me out. But Harvard summer school was ending, and Nikos was on his way to Europe before classes started up again in the fall. In September I began my freshman year at Barnard. Nikos and I didn't meet again until the following year, when I was back in Cambridge. I spent far more time at Yale and Princeton my freshman year than in classrooms or the library, and in June the Barnard deans wisely suggested that I take a year or two off. I moved back in with my parents, learned to type, and got a job at Harvard with time off to study acting at Boston University. Joan Baez was in my acting class. She, too, lived with her parents in nearby Belmont, and 3 mornings a week she'd pick me up on her Vespa, and off we'd go. For the next 2 years I acted in the Poets Theatre and in various Harvard productions, where Nikos and I rediscovered each other and began to go out, casually at first and soon with a new fire. Nikos paid attention to me, to my clothes, to my stories about growing up in Woods Hole, to my theatrical ambitions. He seemed hungry to know everything about me and made me feel as if I had a wealth of treasure to offer him, bright gems to delight another person, something I'd never felt before. His senior year, Nikos moved off campus into an apartment with 2 classmates, a grown-up arrangement with separate bedrooms and no parietal hours, unlike in the Harvard dorms. One of his roommates had a live-in girlfriend whose diaphragm sat carelessly on the shelf above the bathroom sink. I was still a virgin, a nice girl who couldn't imagine chatting with my doctor, also my mother's doctor, about birth control. I would eye the diaphragm, thinking there was something slutty about such open premarital sex. Weren't we supposed to save ourselves for our husbands? My relationship with Nikos intensified. I stopped seeing other men, awash in the delirium of first love and dissolving boundaries, in believing I belonged to someone else. Nikos brought me to Rye, New York, to visit his elegant Greek parents. Their house on the edge of a famous country club couldn't have been more different from my parents' house in Cambridge, with its motley collection of well-thumbed books, scarred family furniture, balding oriental rugs, and even a few dark portraits of ancestors. At the house in Rye, luminous French impressionist paintings with their own recessed ceiling lights glowed on the walls, and my feet sank into lush, snow-white carpets. I enjoyed Nikos's parents, but not his unease when he was with them. In Rye, even his posture was different. He hunched over, no longer 6'2". He was never without a cigarette, and worst of all, he had trouble with words. Sometimes the effort of speaking seemed almost unbearable. Alone with me, or with his friends, Nikos was a gifted talker with curious stories and the wit of a wordsmith. But when he was in his father's house, he was nearly mute. Luckily, he would soon make his own separate life. His parents took me skiing in Vermont and to family parties, one on an enormous, sleek, well-staffed yacht in Long Island Sound, and others at lavish Westchester houses, where soigné women glittered around gaming tables, and prosperous...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?